The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and I remember the exact minute because everything after that felt like it stopped moving. I was already awake, sitting at my kitchen table in my small home outside Boston, holding my second cup of coffee and watching the snow fall slowly onto the empty street. The house was quiet in a way only lonely houses are quiet. My phone vibrated against the wood table, and when I looked down, I saw my younger brother's name on the screen. We had not spoken in almost 3 weeks, not since our last tense visit to our mother at Willow Creek Care Center. I answered and said hello. He did not ask how I was or ease into the call. His voice was flat and careful, like he had practiced what he was about to say. He told me he had difficult news. He said our mother passed away last night in her sleep. For a moment, the words did not land. I stared at the wall in front of me and waited for my mind to catch up. I asked him what he meant. I told him I was planning to visit her later that morning. He did not slow down or pause to let me react. He said she went peacefully and that these things happen at her age. My hand began to shake as I set my coffee mug down before it spilled. Before I could ask anything else, he continued speaking, and his tone shifted from serious to cold. He said the funeral was already scheduled for Friday and that all the arrangements were handled. Then he said the will was very clear. He said everything was being left to him. He listed the house, the cabin in Maine, and her savings as if he were reading from a checklist. He told me I would not be receiving anything and warned me not to contest it. Then he ended the call. I stood there in my kitchen holding my phone long after the screen went dark, trying to understand what had just happened. My mother was supposedly gone, and the first thing my brother wanted to make sure of was that I stayed out of the way. There was no sympathy in his voice. There was no shared grief. Only control. My name is Parker, and I am 62 years old. I spent most of my life working in public schools before retiring 5 years ago. My husband died suddenly 4 years ago from a heart attack, and since then, my mother had been the person who kept me steady. She called every morning, asked if I had eaten, and reminded me that life did not end just because one chapter closed. My brother is 5 years younger than me. We were close as children, but adulthood pulled us in different directions. He went into real estate and always talked about success, even when the signs told a different story. His wife worked long shifts as a nurse, and money always seemed tight behind the scenes. Our mother, Parker, was 85 years old. She was a retired librarian who loved books, puzzles, and quiet routines. Until 9 months ago, she lived on her own and refused help from anyone. That changed when my brother stepped in and insisted she needed supervision. He convinced her to give him power of attorney, saying it was just to help manage bills and appointments. I felt uneasy, but trusted her judgment. Within weeks, everything changed. He told me she had dementia. He moved her into Willow Creek Care Center. When I first visited her there, my heart broke. She sat in a chair by the window, silent and distant, staring at nothing. She did not recognize me, and when she spoke, her words were scattered and confused. I asked her doctor how this decline could happen so fast. He told me dementia can progress quickly in older patients. I wanted to believe him, even though something inside me did not. I still visited 3 times a week. I held her hand and spoke to her softly, even when she stared past me as if I were a stranger. My brother visited far less often and never stayed long. Now, standing alone in my kitchen after that call, everything clicked into place. This was not grief. This was something calculated. I picked up my phone and called Willow Creek Care Center. I told the woman who answered that my brother had just informed me my mother passed away. There was a pause on the line. She said she had no record of that and asked me to hold while she checked. My heart started racing. When she returned, she told me my mother was alive and eating breakfast in the dining room. I felt my knees weaken as I sat down. I asked her not to tell anyone I called, especially my brother. After I hung up, I sat in silence, staring at the snow outside my window. He had lied about her deaths. And if he could lie about something that big, I was afraid of what he was planning next. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that call, staring at the thin line of snow gathering along the edge of the window, trying to slow my breathing and think clearly because panic was not going to help my mother. Once the shock settled, one truth became impossible to ignore, and that was the fact that my brother had lied to me about her being dead, and that meant I could not trust anything else he had said over the past 9 months. I picked up my phone again and called my son, needing to hear a steady voice before I did anything else. When he answered, his voice was groggy, and he told me it was barely 7 in the morning there, but the moment I told him what happened, he was wide awake. I told him his uncle claimed his grandmother died, but the nursing home confirmed she was alive and eating breakfast. I told him I felt something was very wrong and that I was scared of what might already be happening behind my back. He listened quietly and then told me this was not just family trouble, but something serious, something that could be considered elder abuse and fraud. Hearing those words out loud made my stomach turn, because this was not how families were supposed to treat one another. After we hung up, I got dressed and drove to Willow Creek Care Center without telling anyone where I was going. The drive felt longer than usual, and every red light made my nerves worse. I kept thinking about the way my brother's voice sounded on the phone, not sad or shaken, but controlled and sharp. When I walked into the building, the familiar smell of disinfectant and warm food hit me, and I signed in like I always did. The staff greeted me politely, and nothing about the place felt like a woman had died there the night before. I found my mother sitting by the window in the common area, her hands folded in her lap, staring outside at the pale winter sky. She looked smaller than she used to, thinner, but very much alive. For a brief moment, I just stood there watching her chest rise and fall, letting relief wash over me. I sat beside her and spoke her name softly, telling her it was me and that I was there to see her. She turned her head slowly, her eyes passing over my face without recognition, and the familiar ache settled in my chest again. I stayed with her for over an hour, holding her hand and talking about ordinary things, about the snow, about my son, about memories from when I was young. She did not respond much, but something about her felt different that day, like she was listening more than usual, even if she could not show it. As I was getting ready to leave, one of the nurses stopped me in the hallway and asked if everything was okay because I looked pale. I told her I was fine, but asked a simple question that had been bothering me since the phone call. I asked if my brother had been visiting more often lately. The nurse hesitated before answering, which immediately caught my attention, and then said he had been coming by frequently, but usually stayed for short periods, and asked a lot of questions about paperwork and medications. That did not sit right with me at all. I thanked her and walked out to my car, my mind racing through everything I had seen and heard. By the time I got home, I knew I could not handle this alone, and I needed someone who understood the law and could tell me what my options were. I called an attorney a friend once recommended, someone who specialized in elder law, and explained the situation as calmly as I could. He listened carefully and then told me that if my brother was abusing his power of attorney or misrepresenting my mother's condition, it could be a criminal matter, but I would need proof. Proof was the word that echoed in my head after we ended the call. That evening, I returned to Willow Creek quietly and later than usual, hopping to avoid attention. My mother was already in her room, sitting in her chair by the window, the light dim and the hallway quiet. I sat with her again, watching her closely, noticing small things I had ignored before, the way her eyes followed me when she thought I was not looking, the way her hand squeezed mine just a little than expected. As I stood to leave, my phone vibrated in my pocket with an incoming call from a blocked number. I almost ignored it, but something told me not to. I answered and said hello, and for a moment there was only silence on the line. Then I heard a faint voice whisper my name, and it was a voice I knew better than my own. It was my mother. I stood frozen beside my car with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to my own name come through the speaker in a weak but familiar voice, and my first thought was that stress had finally made me imagine things. I asked who was speaking, even though my heart already knew the answer. She told me it was her and asked me to listen carefully because she did not have much time. Her voice was low and controlled, not confused the way it usually sounded during my visits, and that alone made my skin prickle. She told me to come back to her room later that night, after 10, and to make sure my brother was not there. She told me not to tell anyone about the call, and then the line went dead before I could say anything else. I stood there in the cold parking lot, staring at my phone as snow drifted down around me, trying to understand how this was possible when I had just seen her barely speaking an hour earlier. By the time I drove home, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and my mind kept circling the same questions. How did she call me? Why now? And what was she afraid of? I waited until it was dark and checked the time more times than I can count. Just after 10, I drove back to Willow Creek, parking farther away than usual and entering through a side door using the code I had been given months earlier. The building was quiet, with only a few lights on and the low hum of nighttime activity. I walked slowly down the hallway toward her room, every step feeling heavier than the last. When I opened the door, she was sitting up in bed with the lamp turned low, and the moment she looked at me, I knew something was different. Her eyes were clear and focused, not distant or empty, and she lifted her hand slightly as if to tell me to close the door. She told me to sit down because we needed to talk, and there was not much time. I sat on the edge of the chair, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. I asked her if she was okay and what was happening, and she looked at me with a calm expression I had not seen in months. She told me she was fine and had been fine the whole time. She told me she had been pretending. For a moment, I could not breathe. I asked her what she meant, and she reached out and took my hand with a firm grip that felt nothing like the weak hand I had been holding during my visits. She told me she needed to know something before the end of her life, and that was which of her children would care for her when there was nothing to gain. She said when my brother suggested becoming her power of attorney, she saw an opportunity to find out the truth. She explained that she consulted her own lawyer before signing anything and quietly moved most of her assets into a protected trust that my brother could not access. She said she left just enough visible money to see what he would do. I felt dizzy listening to her speak so clearly, explaining things with the same sharp mind I remembered from my childhood. I asked her why she did not tell me, and her face softened in a way that made my throat tighten. She said she had to test both of us fairly, and that meant letting me believe she was gone even when it hurt her to do so. She said she needed to see who would show up when she could not give anything back. She told me she knew I came 3 times a week, even when she pretended not to recognize me, and she told me she heard every word I spoke to her. I could not stop the tears from falling, and she squeezed my hand gently and told me to stay calm because we were not done yet. She said my brother had already taken money from the accounts he could access and had been pressuring her to sign papers she did not understand. She said she recorded everything and kept careful notes, pretending confusion while watching him grow more desperate. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She told me he said she would have an accident soon and that everything would be settled after the funeral on Friday. I told her we needed to call the police immediately, but she shook her head and told me there was already a plan in motion and that her lawyer was involved. She asked me if I trusted her, and I told her I always had. As I left her room that night, my mind was spinning with fear and disbelief, and the quiet hallway felt different now, like something dangerous was moving just beneath the surface. When I reached my car, my phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from my brother asking where I had been that evening. I did not reply to the message right away, and instead I sat in my car for several minutes with the engine off, watching the dark outline of the building and trying to steady my hands because I knew that every move I made from now on mattered. On the drive home, I replayed my mother's words again and again, hearing the calm certainty in her voice and realizing how much strength it must have taken for her to pretend for so long. The fear finally gave way to anger, not loud anger, but the kind that settles deep and sharp when someone crosses a line they can never uncross. When I got home, I sent a short reply saying I had been out running errands and turned my phone face down on the table. I barely slept that night, lying awake and listening to the quiet house while my thoughts raced through everything my mother had told me. Early the next morning, I called the attorney she mentioned and introduced myself, telling him my mother said he was already aware of the situation. He confirmed it immediately and told me he had been working closely with her for weeks to document everything carefully and legally. He explained that my brother had already transferred a large amount of money from accounts he believed he controlled, and that those transactions were being tracked. He said the goal was to let things play out just enough to remove any doubt about intent, but not so far that my mother was placed in immediate danger. That part scared me more than anything else. Later that day, I returned to Willow Creek pretending everything was normal. I greeted the staff, signed in, and walked to my mother's room with a calm face even though my chest felt tight. She was sitting in her chair when I arrived, staring out the window, and the moment she saw me, her eyes changed just slightly before she slipped back into her confused expression. I played my role too. I spoke softly and repeated things when she pretended not to understand, and I watched carefully as the door opened and closed during my visit. Every sound in the hallway made me tense, especially when I heard familiar footsteps approaching. My brother walked in later that afternoon with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He barely acknowledged me before turning his attention to our mother, speaking loudly and slowly as if she were a child. I stayed quiet and observed the way he hovered near her purse and paperwork, how his patience thinned when she hesitated or asked questions. He pulled me aside before leaving and asked why I had been visiting so often lately. I told him I was worried and wanted to help, and he responded by reminding me again that he was the one in charge now. His words were polite, but the message underneath was clear. That evening, I received another call from my mother's attorney, who told me investigators were now quietly involved and that we needed to stay exactly on course. He warned me that people who feel trapped often make reckless decisions, and I knew exactly who he was talking about. The next day, my brother showed up again, this time carrying a folder full of documents and a tight expression on his face. I was not there, but later that night my mother told me everything during another brief, careful conversation when no one else was around. She said he pressured her to sign papers transferring ownership of the house and the cabin. She said she pretended not to understand and scribbled her name incorrectly, watching his frustration grow. She told me he kept glancing at the door, checking the time, like someone running out of options. That night, I could not shake the feeling that things were accelerating. On Thursday evening, my phone rang again, and this time it was him. He told me the funeral details once more and asked if I planned to attend. His voice sounded tight, almost strained, and when I said yes, there was a pause on the line that lasted just a second too long. After the call ended, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the dark television screen and thinking about how far this had gone. My mother was pretending to be helpless. My brother was pretending to mourn. And somewhere between those two lies, something very real and very dangerous was unfolding. Just before midnight, I received a short message from my mother that simply said he was here, and something felt wrong. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, knowing in my gut that whatever happened next would change everything. I drove faster than I should have, keeping my eyes on the road while my thoughts stayed fixed on that short message from my mother. Because when she said something felt wrong, I knew it was not fear speaking but instinct. By the time I reached Willow Creek, The parking lot was nearly empty, and the building looked quiet in that uneasy way places do late at night. I parked a little farther away than usual and walked in through the side entrance, using the code with shaking fingers and reminding myself to breathe slowly and stay calm. The hallway lights were dim, and the sound of my footsteps felt too loud as I moved toward my mother's room. When I reached the door, I paused and listened, but I could not hear voices, only the low hum of the building settling for the night. I opened the door carefully. My mother was sitting in her chair, her posture slightly slumped, playing the role she had perfected, while my brother stood near her with his back partly turned toward me. He was holding something in his hand, and when he noticed me, his body stiffened just enough to tell me I was not expected. He asked what I was doing there so late, his voice controlled but sharp around the edges. I told him I had come to check on Mom because I could not sleep, and I watched his eyes narrow slightly as if he were measuring how much trouble I might be. He turned back to her and spoke in a soothing tone that did not match his tense posture. He told her it was time for her medication and held out what looked like a syringe, explaining it was to help her rest. My heart began to pound so hard, I thought it might give me away. I stepped closer and asked what he was giving her, trying to keep my voice steady, and he replied that it was none of my concern and that the nurse had already approved it. He reminded me again that he was in charge of her care and that I was overstepping. My mother looked at me then, just for a brief second, and in that glance I saw something clear and alert before she lowered her eyes again. She reached for the medication slowly, her hands trembling just enough to sell the act. I wanted to stop everything right then, to shout and pull the truth into the open, but I remembered her words and the attorney's warning, and I forced myself to stay still. She pretended to take the medication, moving carefully and deliberately, and my brother watched closely before relaxing slightly and smoothing her hair as if he were comforting her. He said tomorrow would be better and that everything would finally be settled. When he turned to leave, he warned me not to interfere anymore and told me I was only making things harder for everyone. Then he walked out without another glance, his footsteps fatting down the hallway. The moment the door closed, my mother looked up at me, her expression sharp and focused, and she quietly showed me that she had not swallowed anything. She told me she was fine and asked me to sit with her for a moment while we both listened to make sure he was gone. We spoke in low voices, and she told me that he had been growing more desperate, talking openly now about the funeral and saying things would be over soon. She told me he was running out of time and knew it. I stayed with her until I was sure she was safe, then slipped out quietly and sat in my car for several minutes, letting the adrenaline drain from my body. I called her attorney and told him exactly what I had seen, and his voice turned serious as he told me we were very close to the end of this. Friday morning arrived too quickly. I dressed slowly, choosing black clothes with hands that would not stop shaking, and drove toward Riverside Memorial Chapel with a strange heaviness in my chest. The parking lot was already full when I arrived, and people I barely recognized were standing in small groups, speaking in hushed voices. Inside, flowers lined the walls, and at the front of the room was a large photograph of my mother from years ago, smiling and full of life. Seeing her image there, while knowing she was alive, felt unreal, like standing inside someone else's lie. I took a seat near the front and waited. Across the aisle, my brother sat with his wife and children, his face set in a practiced expression of sorrow. He nodded at people offering condolences, playing his part perfectly. At exactly 2:00, he stood and walked to the podium, straightening his jacket and clearing his throat as the room grew quiet. As he began to speak about loss and love and responsibility, I felt my heart slow in a way that surprised me, because deep down I knew this was the moment everything had been building toward. And I knew the truth was about to walk through the door. I stayed seated for a moment after they took him away, holding my mother's hand while the room slowly emptied, and the noise faded into a heavy silence that felt louder than the chaos before it. People avoided my eyes as they passed, not out of anger, but confusion, as if they had walked into a story they did not understand and were afraid to ask about. When the last of the guests were gone, the police officers returned and spoke quietly with my mother, asking if she was strong enough to leave or if she needed a few minutes. She told them she was fine and asked me to help her stand. Her grip on my arm was steady, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was supporting my mother again instead of the other way around. Outside, the cold air hit us both, and she paused for a second, taking a deep breath like someone stepping back into the world after being underwater. An officer explained what would happen next, that there would be statements, interviews, and paperwork, and that my brother would not be released anytime soon. I listened, nodding, but my focus stayed on my mother's face, watching the calm settle back into her features. We were driven back to Willow Creek, not as patients and visitors this time, but as part of an ongoing investigation. The staff greeted us with a mix of shock and relief, and I could tell some of them had suspected something but did not know how to speak up. My mother was taken to her room, and I stayed with her while officers spoke to administrators down the hall. She sat in her chair and let out a long breath, then looked at me and said she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. I brought her a glass of water and sat across from her, finally allowing myself to feel everything I had been holding back since that first phone call days ago. She told me she was sorry for the worry she caused me, and I told her she had nothing to apologize for. I told her she had protected herself in the only way she could, and that she trusted me when it mattered most. She smiled at that, a small, tired smile, and closed her eyes for a moment. Later that evening, an investigator came in and asked if I was ready to give my statement. I told him yes, and we went through everything slowly from the beginning: the call, the lie, the nursing home confirmation, and the late-night visit. I spoke carefully, making sure each detail was clear, because I knew my words mattered now in a way they never had before. When it was over, I felt drained but lighter, like something heavy had finally been set down. That night, I stayed in a chair by my mother's bed, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing as she slept peacefully without pretending for the first time in months. The room felt different, safer, even though nothing was truly over yet. The next morning brought more questions and more quiet conversations. Lawyers came and went, and paperwork piled up faster than I could track. My mother's attorney explained that the evidence already collected was strong, but there would still be hearings and delays. He told us to prepare for months, not days. I nodded, understanding that justice rarely moves quickly. News spread faster than I expected. Family members called, some angry, some confused, and some apologetic for believing a story that never felt right to them either. I answered what I could and ignored the rest, focusing on what mattered most: keeping my mother safe and grounded. That afternoon, I helped her pack a few personal things: books she loved, a framed photo from years ago, and a sweater she always wore when she felt cold. She told me she did not want to stay at Willow Creek anymore if she did not have to, and I told her we would figure something out together. As the sun set outside her window, she reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. She told me the hardest part was knowing how close she came to losing everything, not her money, but her voice. She told me that pretending to be helpless taught her how easily people stop listening. I sat with her as the room grew dim, understanding that the truth had come out, but the real work was only beginning, and whatever came next, we would face it side by side. The weeks that followed moved slowly, one careful step at a time, and I stayed close to my mother through every meeting, every phone call, and every long afternoon where waiting felt heavier than action. There were days when she was quiet and thoughtful, and days when the weight of what had happened showed clearly on her face, but she never once said she wished she had done things differently. The legal process took months, just as the attorney warned us it would. My brother tried at first to explain his way out, claiming confusion and stress, but the evidence spoke louder than his words. Records showed the money transfers. Video showed the pressure. Medical reports exposed prescriptions that never should have been written. Piece by piece, the truth settled into place. In the end, he accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to prison, ordered to repay what he took, and permanently lost his professional license. His wife filed for divorce soon after, and custody of the children was granted to her. That part hurt more than I expected, because no matter what he had done, those children were still family, and they were paying a price they never chose. My mother moved out of Willow Creek and into a small condo not far from my home. She said she was finished with big spaces and long hallways and wanted something simple where she could see people she trusted every day. We started having dinner together twice a week, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting quietly, both of us grateful for ordinary moments again. She also began volunteering with a local group that helps seniors understand their rights and recognize signs of abuse. Watching her speak calmly and clearly about her experience made me realize how strong she truly was. She did not share her story for sympathy, but for prevention, because she did not want anyone else to feel invisible the way she had pretended to be. One evening, months later, we sat on my back porch watching another winter snowfall, the kind that comes softly and settles without noise. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and held a warm mug in both hands. I asked her if she ever regretted testing us the way she did. She thought for a long moment before answering and said she regretted that it was necessary, but not that she learned the truth. She told me she needed to know who would show up when she had nothing to give, and she said that mattered more to her than any inheritance. I told her I never fought because of money, and she nodded, saying she knew that from the beginning. She said love shows itself in patience, in presence, and in staying even when it hurts. We sat there quietly after that, listening to the soft sound of snow landing on the ground, and for the first time since that early morning phone call, my chest felt light. Life did not return to the way it was before, but it moved forward in a better direction. There was healing, not perfect or complete, but real. There was honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. And there was time, which felt like the greatest gift of all. If you stayed with this story until the end, thank you for listening and for caring. Stories like this matter because they remind us to protect the people who once protected us. If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Your support helps more real stories like this reach the people who need them most.